So I'd really like to get started. It's traditional in interfaith gatherings to offer a prayer or a reflection. And given what's going on in the world today, I thought a prayer for Ukraine would make sense. So I will offer a prayer for Ukraine as we start. God in heaven, creator of all flesh and worker of wonders, do not stay silent, do not remain voiceless, do not keep aloof. For an evil man has come to power and declared war on another country, saying, we will rise up violently against you in battle. But you, God, have commanded us in your sacred scriptures, saying, do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. I am God. Therefore, make the aggressor desist from destruction. We pray to you now, God of the spirits of all flesh, to use your infinite power to end these acts of bloodshed and terror. Spread peace over the earth and bring joy to all of its inhabitants, so that the words of the prophets can be fulfilled. The warrior's bow will be broken and peace will be promised to all peoples. God will judge between the nations and arbitrate between many countries. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up war against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And let us say, Amen.
Amen.
So Amani has a bunch of very important announcements. There's so much going on. There's so many things that we can be active on.
Thank you, Phyllis. Can everyone hear me? Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Amani Reed. I'm the Policy Engagement Manager for Pennsylvania Interfaith Power and Light, working very closely with Phyllis and a lot of others on the call. And I wanted to let you know about 3 actions that Pennsylvania Interfaith Power and Light is currently taking. We're also looking for volunteers for a few actions with Climate Action Campaign. We'll be doing work with them throughout the year. That includes petitions, letter writing, lobbying, and in-person events like town halls and rallies. And as we know, we as a nation have a moral responsibility and as people of faith to care about climate. So there is a Action Climate Can't Wait petition, which I'm going to drop in the chat. If anyone's interested in signing it, it only takes a few seconds. And this is going out to President Biden, his cabinet, and all members of Congress on climate and clean energy investments, which we need right now. There's also a sign-on, which I'm going to drop in the chat, for House Bill 637. This is a RGGI disapproval resolution. And if you're interested, we're looking for people to sign on to this as well. And just for a few other updates on RGGI, if you guys are not aware, Governor Wolf vetoed the Senate's concurrent regulatory review resolution, which was also known as SCRR1. And if you want more info, I'll put that in the chat. I'm going to have quite a few things. I'm going to admit this person. And so, okay, thank you. So SCRR1 is a resolution that would have blocked participation in RGGI. Unfortunately, the legislator continues to stand in the way. And next week on the 29th, the state Senate is planning a vote to override the governor's veto. So very, very much encouraging everyone to sign on to this letter. Also to contact your legislators, representatives, and senator. And the last thing I wanted to mention, we also have a few scripts. If you guys are interested in writing a letter or sending out an email in regards to RGGI and also to President Biden, I'll have information on that as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So much is going on. And I want to welcome the people who came after we started. We started right on time because we always run over time and we don't like to do that. So welcome to all of you. Some new faces and some people that we know well in these monthly meetings. So as you know, in last year, we passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and we also passed, the Congress and the senators and the president signed the Rescue Act. And that gives lots of money for states and other municipalities and counties to be investing in infrastructure for EV charging or cleaning up abandoned oil well drills, and for taking lead out of the pipes and that sort of stuff. So that's the obvious things, but there's so much money in these packages that could be tweaked and used for environmental sustainability efforts, and depending on how the rules get written or depending on the proposals. So I thought it would be a good idea if we took some time tonight to really think about and delve into the idea of how we can use this, what I call a windfall from the government, to help us to move forward on sustainability and an environment. And when I think about who is on the top of things, Union of Concerned Scientists always comes to my mind about who's knowledgeable, who can help us out, who can give us a real insight. And I am always thrilled when the Union of Concerned Scientists officials say yes to my requests. So I'm really happy to invite Brian LaShier to speak to us tonight. He's the senior Washington representative from the Union of Concerned Scientists Climate and Energy Program. I've heard him speak several times and he always is wonderful. And I am grabbing my pen and taking notes. Please feel free to put questions in the chat and we hope to have some time to be able to answer them. So Brian, take it away. Thank you so much.
Of course, Phyllis, thank you for the very warm introduction. I feel like I've been hyped up quite a bit, so I hope I am able to share some useful information. I should note that I had the pleasure of working with Phyllis on a recent lobby day, so day of advocacy with congressional offices through UCS. So that was really appreciate Phyllis, your contributions there, and appreciate the invitation today.
Thank you.
So, of course. So my plan was to kind of go through some of the provisions that are in. So there's two different, as you likely know, and if this is too elementary, let me know and we can change course. But there's two different infrastructure packages essentially. One is the Build Back Better Act, which has probably been in the news the most lately, and the other is the one way back from November, called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which has gone by other names too, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill and various acronyms. So I was going to kind of give an overview of what's in those, especially with an eye towards money that may be coming from the federal government to state and local entities. But if that's maybe a little too on the nose, and if you all have a familiarity with that, I can just dive into an admittedly shorter section that I have some notes on as far as like what to look out for from your end as far as getting engaged and what the process may look like going forward. So Phyllis, do you have some guidance on maybe what the most interesting path might be there?
You're muted, Phyllis.
We could do a real quick poll. Brian offered two alternatives. Brian, the first alternative is to do an overview of the packages, and the second alternative was more of a deep dive, I believe.
And I'm also happy to just do like a super basic like rundown and then leave most of the time for questions.
Okay, now you're giving three alternatives. So
I'm presenting too many alternatives.
Let's do a voting by 1, 2, or 3. Which alternative you want? Brian, tell us which is alternative 1 again in a sentence.
Oh, I made this very complicated. So the first alternative is, would you all like a great amount of detail on what's in the respective infrastructure packages?
That's 1. Okay, 2.
I'll say option 2 is I can kind of breeze through that and we'll spend most of the time on kind of you all presenting questions to me and I'll do my best to provide information. So it'll be the bulk, mostly Q&A, and I'll just leave it at the 2 options.
Okay, so do you want an overview or that would be 1, or do you want a Q&A? So just put your fingers up like I have mine and vote.
What is 3?
He dropped it.
We got rid of 3. We're keeping it simple.
Looks like 1 wins.
Okay, I will, again, feel free to, I'll try and monitor the chat with questions or for questions, but I'll go ahead and dive right in here. One of the ones I mentioned, so the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So what is that? Basically, that's $1.2 trillion spending bill that was signed into law by the president. Again, I mentioned this was back in November 2021. and it was negotiated in a bipartisan fashion, largely in the Senate. As far as where all that money is going, as the name suggests, it is going largely toward built infrastructure across multiple sectors of the economy: transportation, water, agriculture, energy, broadband infrastructure, cybersecurity, disaster response, as well as quite a big chunk of money going towards advanced energy R&D, such as things like battery storage and hydrogen as an alternative fuel and things along those lines. But some areas that might be of particular interest, and these are sort of going across the federal government, but the key thing to keep in mind is that these federal agencies are going to be doling out this money, and I'll speak about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. But they're going to be sending this money to states and local governments in relatively short order. And again, it's key. I think it's key to distinguish between the IIJA and the Build Back Better Act, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But those are two distinctive funding avenues from the federal government. So what's in the IIJA? What's in the infrastructure bill? So under transportation, there's tens of billions of dollars for public transit. Things coming through the FTA, Federal Transportation Authority, for sort of planning and engineering and building out these systems, upgrading aging parts of the system, whether it's rail or buses, in the public transit space. There's a $5 billion program coming out of EPA for states and localities to replace old school buses, so the old diesel buses, with zero emission versions, whether they're electric or sort of lower emission. So that could make a significant dent as those fleets age or continue to age. And then $2.5 billion for electric charging infrastructure. So basically grants to build out sort of these corridors to make it a lot easier to travel far, if you have an electric vehicle, to travel farther from your home and not have to worry about where am I going to fill up the tank, essentially, along the way. So there's a lot of momentum sort of generally beyond just this bill to start building out those corridors across the country as electric vehicles start to become more commonplace in the market. And we can talk. I'm not an EV expert, but I'm happy to do my best to talk a bit about the nuances there, because it seems like that's an area of interest for you all, perhaps. So in the area of water infrastructure, so there's a lot of money going towards cleaning up kind of legacy pollution, essentially stuff that's been around for a while that should not be. So a lot of money going towards lead service line replacement, for instance, with specifically targeted to disproportionately affected communities that have been dealing with these issues for a long time, and it's long overdue for them to be addressed. Big chunk of money over a 5-year period going to the states to support municipal planning construction about sewage system overflows, which can have a lot of pollution and public health impacts. Things for cleaning up brownfields and diverting money to Superfund program, or Superfunds, cleaning up Superfund sites. And one that I thought was maybe of particular interest for Pennsylvania. So there's a $50 million program through EPA for funding state efforts to gain authority over kind of the management of Class 6, basically underground injection wells that are typically associated with things like fracking or things of that nature. That's probably the most common, honestly. So used in oil and gas production, and that's regulated through the Safe Drinking Water Act. I'm not an expert on that, but I thought that was noteworthy as far as like how the states may exert more authority over those sites, and I thought it was interesting that there was funding for that. As far as like land use and natural resources, so another one that I feel like is very relevant to Pennsylvania, there was $11 billion set aside for the Abandoned Mine Reclamation Fund. So essentially what that does is for historical coal mining sites, so like pre-1977, essentially, that money is meant to restore land and waterways that have been degraded by that coal mining activity. And that's so that's a major program, really. And I forget the exact nature of the money because the program's been around before. So I think this is maybe reintroducing more funding into that. And there's also nearly $5 billion for remediating and plugging and reclaiming abandoned oil and gas wells, and that's on federal, state, and tribal lands. So again, obviously a large fossil fuel industry presence in the state of Pennsylvania. So as far as sort of transitioning those industries and cleaning up the impacts of those industries, whether current or past, there's quite a bit of funding in this infrastructure bill. And then I'm happy to go into more detail on some of the energy provisions, but basically a lot of things you all are probably familiar with because they've been around a while. Through the U.S. Department of Energy, the Weatherization Assistance Program got a significant increase through the IIJA. And then you also have things like the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grants and LIHEAP, so the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program for assisting with winter heating. And then finally, there's a big chunk of money as far as disaster response. So states are basically have been given permission to take some of this infrastructure funding that they're receiving and apply it towards disaster resilience and mitigation projects. So preparing for the impacts of climate change and natural disasters to hopefully reduce those impacts ahead of time. And same as far as disaster mitigation, several $billion dollars given to FEMA's Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, which provides a lot of financial and technical assistance to states and communities, giving them tools to reduce flood risk. So programs like strategic buyouts or building more buffers to around floodplains. So that's what I have for the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Now, again, the second funding stream that I mentioned, the Build Back Better Act. Actually, maybe should I pause for a moment? Are there any questions? Because that was a lot of information I just passed to you. And I'm happy to provide this stuff in writing as well because it's a lot. So.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
In the $2.5 billion you mentioned is available for electric charging infrastructure. Do you know if that sort of thing would be available for congregations?
That's a good question. I would have to look that up actually. But that's a good question as far as what types of organizations or entities may qualify for the funding. I would have to follow up on that. I'm actually not sure. But I would be surprised if nonprofits or faith-based organizations did not with like actual building, like so a church, did not qualify for something like that. But I'm not sure. That's a good question though.
Okay, so I'm wondering if you could, if you do research that and come up with a basically written response, I'm wondering if could you send that to Phyllis and then Phyllis could send it out to us or to Amani?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to look into that. Not a problem.
Okay, and then I have one more question. Same kind of question. Do you think the weatherization funds would be available for congregations?
That again, I would be surprised if they were not, because I know community based programs often are made available to faith-based institutions and their buildings. And if someone on the line knows, actually, please feel free. But I'm not super familiar with the exact provisions of that.
Okay, one more question. Sorry to dominate the questions.
No problem.
One more question. So do I have this right that the money would go from the federal government to the state government and then entities would have to apply to the state government to get the funding and it would be a grant and not a loan or a partial funding?
For which program?
For any of the programs. So congregation, if congregations actually qualified for the charging stations, would the money flow go from the federal government to the state government and then the congregation would have to apply to the state government?
Yes, yes, that for many of these programs, that is typically the case. Yes, you would. The organization would be applying directly through, and it's obviously it's going to vary quite a bit. It might be like a state like environmental office or the energy office or whatever the agency may be. But yes, that is correct. As this money goes out the door from the federal government, it's basically going. The onus is basically going to be on the states to set up the program infrastructure to accommodate that and to be able to receive applications and requests, or if they're issuing it, to make those decisions to where the money would be going. So you're absolutely correct on that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
And I see people with their hands up. I don't know who went first, so feel free to speak up.
I think Ed had his hand up first, possibly, but anyone can start.
Well, I'm from Delaware County, and our Friends meeting and a couple of us in it are trying to support the new Delco Sustainability Initiative. And I sort of tried to listen to see what the Office of Sustainability might be able to draw on. And you may have partially answered that already with regard to money flowing through the states. But of the things that you described, what seemed to me to be most available to the county would have to do with the lower emissions of school buses. And I'm wondering whether there's anything else that you could suggest that the Office of Sustainability, if they're not already aware of it, which they may be, might want to try to find out about, that would be useful to them in trying to develop a whole sustainability agenda for Delaware County.
So that was actually, so that's a great question to be asking. And it sounds like what I was going to ask in turn was, does the county currently have a sort of, it sounds like they do not currently have like either a sustainability plan or like a climate, sort of a climate-based plan. Is that correct? So they're looking to get into that space.
This is a brand new office, and they have been, as I understand things correctly, which may be wrong, they've been accepted for developing a climate action plan.
Got it. Okay.
So there's been some real initiative. There's been a very recent flip between a longtime Republican council and a Democratic council, and they're trying to move very quickly. And the woman who's in charge seems to me to be somewhat overwhelmed by the amount of stuff, but what they've done is a lot. And they have been in contact with various state agencies and gotten support from some of them.
That's a great question, and it's really encouraging to hear that the county is taking those steps. I think that's exactly the type of thing that they should be doing. As far as additional specific things, I would say, I would say, so it sounds like they're doing the right thing, and I imagine that the individual who's running the office is aware of a lot of sort of like the flagship federal programs, like the weatherization program, for instance, is very well established, and they're probably, I imagine they're sort of matching up as they build out their sustainability plan. They're matching up where can we get assistance through there, and probably having threads come out from that. As far as things that are maybe lesser known, I actually have some resources that I rely on myself, that are focused on kind of local level programs. So things from like, I forget the names, but I'll send them Phyllis's way. They have some good breakdowns of like every like line item within the bill and like what they do, which I think would be maybe too much for this conversation, but it might be helpful to someone who's working on this for the county. I'm happy to share that in case they're not aware of it. But aside from things like the energy grants, and I'm not sure sort of like what the sorry, forgive me, I'm not as familiar with the particular county, but if, for instance, if there's, like I mentioned, there's a lot of money for mitigation of flood risk. So like I would really depend on sort of the specific issues and challenges that the county is facing. It's like not knowing kind of the demographics or the economics or the environmental kind of landscape. It'd be difficult for me to kind of steer them towards specific pots of money, but I feel like there's a lot of ways to.
Storm
Oh,
risk
yeah.
include wastewater?
Oh yes, there's so there's definitely I mentioned there's definitely funding in here to support sort of municipal investment in improved wastewater systems, so that you don't have kind of
That comes through the state rather than some kind of direct.
That's correct. So I believe the county or the locality within the county would have to apply to the state for that funding once it's issued.
Okay.
But I will follow up. Oh, I'm sorry. I will follow up on that question though, and I'll send Phyllis some resources that may be of interest. I'm happy to do that if the county office isn't aware yet. I see we have other hands up though. I want to make sure that I don't spend too long. Thank you,
Brian. I have a related question. My perspective is as the chair of our local environmental advisory council. I've been told that for a municipality to apply to the state for this kind of grant money, that it really is a prerequisite to already have a climate action plan. Could you comment on that?
So I want to make sure I understood. I caught the last part. So it's it's municipalities have been told by the state is who you said was advising that?
Well, I was told this.
You were told.
And this is based on past experience, not this current legislation. That, you know, when the state is allocating the money, that it looks for a pre-existing plan as opposed to just an application. Yes.
So it's been so on the surface that sounds like to me, or I am far from an expert. I've been it's been quite a while since I've been working at the state level. I've been buried in the federal level for quite some time. I used to do state level stuff, but that sounds like an expectation that I would not be surprised to see. I can't verify, but I feel like when the states are looking to see, well, who's going to, and I imagine their thinking is, whether it's a correct or agreeable or not, I imagine their thinking is who's the most prepared to kind of hit the ground running, and who will require, perhaps, I don't know if this, this is just my hypothetical, which county or city will perhaps require the least extra guidance or intervention from the state to use the money effectively. So I think they're looking for kind of oversight and governance and planning structures to be in place before they give out, how many ever thousands or millions of dollars. So I think it's, and a climate and like a sustainability or a climate plan or whatever the label may be, they come in all different forms. So it doesn't necessarily have to be it doesn't have to be like a huge undertaking, relatively speaking. So for instance, obviously the climate plan for the city of Pittsburgh would be very different for maybe the climate or maybe the sustainability plan for like the township of Cranberry or something like that. So it's all about the scaling of it. But to answer your question, that would not surprise me if that was a request coming from a state office.
Thank you.
Of course.
Hi,
Hello.
I'm Tim Beckham, and I've been reading of late the summary for policymakers of the most recent IPCC report. And I'm curious about how effective the IPCC report is in determining policy with regard to a variety of things, whether it's national, international, or more local. And I'm just wondering if the policies that are manifest through the various legislations or potential legislations that you're talking about come at all from any type of study of the IPCC, or even related documents that come from our national government or other national governments across the globe. does anybody choose a broad picture and use that broad picture to determine the specifics of their own individual policies?
I think the very short answer is yes, and I'll explain more. My understanding of the IPCC is that so it's of course it's basically like the aggregation of like the best the scientific community has to offer, collecting all of our collective climate science knowledge at the time and putting it in one place for policymakers especially to access.
Right.
And you'll likely know, like the tricky thing about climate, or the interesting thing about climate, I think, is so it's a global problem, but the impacts can be highly localized. So
Yeah.
to answer, so one way of when you pose the question, what I think of is there are pieces with it. So as far as going really broadly, I'm not sure that even like the federal government. So the federal government, so say the Biden administration, the current administration they've set some emission reduction goals. I think one of them is 50% reduction in climate pollution by the year 2030. So that's a super broad goal. But I think the details of how you get there, and we know that we want to set those, and I think those types of goals I can say with confidence, those are at least partly influenced by the findings that are determined by the scientists who publish the IPCC. So that's sort of like the high level part, but the farther down you get as far as, well, what are the areas of greatest need? Is it going to be, and again, this varies greatly depending on what state or even what part of a state you're talking about. Is the greatest need going to be preparing for things like sea level rise? Is it going to be, we should focus on sort of XYZ technology because it will have the greatest impact on reducing greenhouse gas emissions? So for instance, like methane emissions is one example of something fairly specific that can have a really big impact. And the science is kind of dictated over time that has an outsized impact. So maybe we should start focusing on that more. So there's all these different decision trees can be drawn from the collective understanding of the science, and that evolves over time. But I think it really depends on what level of government you're speaking with and where, and kind of what the local problems may be. Did that kind of get to the question? So there's different, you can kind of break out what the knowledge is in the IPCC into smaller chunks, and those chunks can be a lot more useful to like a state policymaker as opposed to like the whole thing. Did that make sense?
It seems to me like what you're saying is that these policies very often are very specific and local, and that the
Yes.
IPCC is global. So it could be that what is available in the IPCC reports is not all that relevant to what's to be decided at a local and local level. Now, of course, what you're talking about also is at a national level, and that's pretty broad. So my real question, actually what it boils down to, is does anybody that you know of in any form of government, big, medium, small, use the information that's available through the IPCC? And are there scientists that are involved in the IPCC that actually become part of the decision-making process even in these small groups?
To that question, I can say confidently yes, absolutely.
Okay, good.
Yep. No,
Thank you.
Yep. I can definitely say yes to that.
Thank you very much.
Of course. It looks like Thomas is next up.
Thank you. Name is Thomas Howe. You mentioned money available, $5 billion for oil and gas to plug abandoned wells on federal, state, and tribal lands. So that does not include private lands where abandoned wells would be located?
That's a great question. And my understanding is no, it does not include private lands. So again, not an expert on all of this, but so I'm wondering So maybe one question I would pose if I could talk to a state energy officer would be, is it possible for the state to, especially if the well is abandoned, is it possible for the state to purchase the land or some other sort of transaction happen so that they then move forward in addressing sort of the environmental issue with the well? I, however, do not know how that would work. Others on the call may be familiar if that's a possibility, but short answer to your question is no. I don't believe you can do it. I don't believe it authorizes that for private lands.
Yeah, well, God knows we have, tens of thousands of abandoned wells in Pennsylvania that need plugging, and I think most of them are on private land. So that's an issue that we have to look at. The other sort of issue I guess is stormwater plans in Pennsylvania. The state used to fund half the cost of county stormwater plans, and they stopped funding that a decade ago. Now, I presume county stormwater mitigation plans would count as flood reduction efforts, and could be fully funded by this legislation. And it might be an opportunity for, I guess, many counties to revisit their plans and update them and all that.
I would say that's definitely worth looking into. There's one of the things that jumped out at me was just how much water infrastructure and stormwater infrastructure and whether it's drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, you name it. There's a lot of opportunity in this bill for that. So I think it's absolutely taking a look if one is working in that space. And I'm also going to add, because I want to make sure I don't give anyone the wrong information. I'm also going to add their question about the plugging of the wells to my follow-up list, because I'm actually curious myself if that applies to private lands, and I might be misreading what I read.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course. And Phyllis, I wanted to make sure we do a time check, because I'm not sure how much time you all had allocated for
We
today.
usually go till about 8 o'clock, but we wanted to have a little more discussion at the end on another topic. Dana, do you still have another question? Because your hand's still up. Okay. So how about if we go another 10 minutes or so?
Sure. I'm happy to, and I'm just checking the chat real quick. I don't see any questions from anybody. So I'm happy to very quickly just like say a bit about the Build Back Better Act, and then kind of maybe open things up more broadly as far as like maybe like if you all have questions about next steps or how to engage. Or I feel like everyone on this call is very good at engaging with public officials, so I don't think you all need much from me on that. But yeah, so oh, I see someone with a hand up, but I think it went away though.
Yeah, sorry. I'm calling from my phone and laptop. My apologies. I just had a quick question for you before we move forward. You mentioned a $50 million EPA program, I believe an act. I just was wondering if you could say the name of that again. Absolutely. It was mentioned earlier in the call.
Do you remember? Oh, does it have to do with water?
The underground injection wells.
Underground injection wells. Oh yes, yes, I have it here. So yeah, so that was $50 million for funding. Oh yeah, that was funding state efforts to sort of gain primacy over Class 6 underground injection wells, so oil and gas production wells, and that was under the Safe Drinking Water Act.
Thank you.
And I basically have the stuff that the programs that I've shared. I have this written down because my memory isn't that great, so I'm happy to just share that with Phyllis if that's a helpful resource as well.
If I could speak to that for a moment, right now EPA has primacy over the underground injection program in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania has very few underground injection wells due to the geology of the state. It's very fractured, and the ones that we did, the EPA did permit, I think a couple of them are leaking now. So it may be not in the interest of the state to take over primacy of that program because it's one that is fraught with problems.
No, that's a good point. And yeah, and that's actually a point that I was going to make later is um, sometimes sometimes the state's interests or what the state, well, sometimes interests of the state don't necessarily align with what may be the best outcome as far as sort of climate and the environment. So it's good to flag that, it's good to bring up those sorts of things, for sure. And again, I'm not an expert in a lot of this stuff. I just, I just sort of interpret things oftentimes. But that's a good point. That it may be just fine staying in federal hands. So Build Back Better. I feel like you all are probably up to date on what's been happening with this, and the fact is there hasn't been a ton happening lately. So basically, what is it? So again, this was the package that the House Representatives passed back in November as well. It's really, there's a lot of really great stuff in there, but unfortunately, it's largely been sidelined. It never got passed by the Senate. Primarily because of objections from a couple of senators, a couple of Democratic senators who were not interested in seeing the reconciliation process go forward with this bill. There's general feeling in Washington that a new package will sort of a new version of this, a new package will have to emerge based off of what Senator Manchin of West Virginia in particular is willing to vote for. And that will result in a significantly scaled down version of the original package. So despite there being a lot of great things in there, a lot of that might be lost. So that's sort of a pivotal point right now. It's, in my opinion, kind of a narrow window heading through the spring and into the summer for those negotiations to pick up again. And I'm happy to talk more about the federal dynamics, but I feel like we're more interested in sort of the state and local financing. I can say that advocates sort of in the environment, climate, and justice spaces are going to continue to be pushing very hard to preserve as many of those pieces as possible. There's especially strong support for maintaining provisions in the climate and environmental justice sections. So the hope is that those will remain whatever the newest form is. Some of the notable pieces in there that we're hoping will carry over. So there was an electric vehicle tax incentive for consumers to purchase new used electric cars and trucks. There are rebate programs for home efficiency and appliances. There was a proposal to create a methane fee on the oil and gas industry for emissions that result from their actions there, as far as flaring and leakage during extraction of gas. One proposal that will probably not make it, but I thought was really worthwhile, was closing a lot of the tax code loopholes and phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. That's a huge one, but you can guess where the senator from West Virginia falls on that one, as much as we'd like to see that one continue. And there's lots of other programs as well. There's a Clean Energy Sustainability Accelerator that is firmly based at the state level that seeks to issue state level grants and local as well, I believe, for basically it's like an incubator for clean energy projects to get those moving, and many other things as well. As I mentioned earlier, like sort of not naming a lot of the other provisions in the Build Back Better package that are no longer expected to advance, such as the National Clean Energy Standard, which certainly will not be in there, unfortunately. Again, even though I'm very supportive of that personally. The overall package was basically positioned as a key piece of the Biden administration's goal for reducing climate emissions by 50% by 2030, as I mentioned earlier. As far as, so what does this mean for Pennsylvania? What does this mean for you all who are active in the state? So with the IIJA, so the bipartisan infrastructure package I mentioned at the top of the call, starting in January, federal agencies have basically begun their rulemaking process and have begun developing guidance for the implementation of the programs and the investments that Congress has handed down to them. The actual financing will start to get distributed from those federal agencies as early as this summer is one timeline that I saw. So these decisions are happening right now. So it is an important period for that. It's really a great, as far as advocates such as yourselves, it's a really great opportunity to engage through public comment periods and other events, whether it's sort of RFIs, so requests for information, which are oftentimes where organizations such as like Interfaith Power and Light, for instance, like submit comments, commenting on the rulemaking and how they think it should be applied. There's notices of proposed rulemaking. There's like oftentimes town hall style events that agencies will host in different places across the country to gather feedback from state and community-based organizations and constituents. And there's various ways to keep track of these types of things, which you all probably are pretty in the know on how to keep track of those things. But I also say that the Biden administration has made a point of integrating more community outreach and information gathering into their decision-making process of the agencies, definitely more so than the president's predecessor. So this has been really elevated they're not always going to do the best job, but I can say from experience that the agency staff are doing their best to better integrate those opportunities for input and to then take that feedback and actually run with it. So I think that's going to be really crucial for how these federal dollars get spent coming out of these two major infrastructure packages. And as I said, one of them's already moving. It's already been made into law. And I think I sort of hinted at this earlier, but I think there's an expectation that some state governments may seek to disrupt the rollout of these federally financed programs, particularly if they don't necessarily agree with them, whether for political or whatever other reasons. So it's no secret that when something has the climate tag attached to it, it can become a bit of a political lightning rod, unfortunately. So those types of instances, they can either like sit on the money that was given to their state, or maybe try and skirt the prescribed implementation rules or other sorts of actions. So I feel like oversight and public pressure from constituents to both members of Pennsylvania's congressional delegation and also state level public officials will be really important as these things come to pass. I'll admit I'm not as familiar with sort of Pennsylvania's sort of state and local politics. I did used to live in the state for a little bit in Western Pennsylvania, but I see Phyllis giving a thumbs down, so I'm guessing it's challenging, and I'm not even familiar with the policies of the current governor. But I imagine he's at least mostly supportive of a lot of these things, I would hope. But I will say that last thing I'll say is plugging in with policy and advocacy staff at locally based organizations, as you all are certainly doing, such as Interfaith Power and Light, is often the best way to go for those looking sort of make their voice heard and to volunteer time. So I think the fact that you are on this call and have such a keen interest in this is already amazing. Like, you all are doing it's a huge deal. And it's also great to see people like Amani on the call and giving sort of a rundown of all the actions and things happening around the state. So that's fantastic as well. That's exactly the type of people, type of organizations that can help make those connections and can help highlight these types of things. So I will leave it at that. I know we're running short on time, but if there are any questions.
I think Ed has a question.
Yep, go ahead, Ed.
Sorry, I had to unmute. You mentioned in passing the accelerator, which in the Senate was called a National Climate Bank. And I've been interested for some time in financial and monetary policy. And it strikes me that this proposal is something that's somewhat like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation from the New Deal on a small scale and totally independent of the federal government once it gets established, and exists until 2050. And it is for some reason, it's something that nobody knows about. And of all the things, my impression is that of all the things that were in Build Back Better for climate, this would perhaps be the most important thing, because it would support what was going on to deal with the transition in whatever states and localities there was initiative to do something. And so I'm wondering, number one, whether I've tried to get Friends Committee on National Legislation behind this with no particular success. I wonder whether it's something that USC is behind, and whether there's anything that you think that can be done to specifically support it at this point, because I don't know what it is. It all seems, I heard that it's something that Manchin did not object to, but I don't know where to go from there.
And this is a
So-
subject of separate legislation that's pending, the National Infrastructure Bank. If you
It was within Build Back Better at a somewhat reduced, no, it's not the infrastructure bank.
okay,
It's a separate proposal that is focused on climate. The National Infrastructure Bank isn't going anywhere. We miss Congress, but there's a possibility that the accelerator might, because it was in the Build Back Better Act.
So that's correct. That the Clean Energy Sustainability Accelerator is in the Build Back Better Act, and I believe I've heard about the infrastructure bank as well, and I believe it has shades of that. I think they probably have similar goals, if I remember correctly.
I think that's correct. Yeah, but
to your question, so as far as why no one's maybe heard of it, or not many people have heard of it, that was sort of by design, as to keep. So I've been working with some folks who are kind of some of the lead advocates on that program, and there was sort of a quiet campaign to shore up support, because we didn't want basically we didn't want people to realize how good it was and how much good it would do, and then they would want to take it out. So the politics of that were kind of on the quiet side, but that's maybe why it hasn't been advertised as widely in a lot of places. I will say though, I think it is a really big deal. I would definitely agree that it's a big deal. And you're correct in that it is designed to be independent once it gets set up. So it's been a while since I've read how it operates, but my understanding, and I'll send a resource on this as well. I definitely have something on hand I can send to you all. And thank you for bringing it to the attention of other organizations as well. That's great. So the federal money basically seeds the organization to be set up, and then that organization takes that funding and it distributes money on an independent basis, judging things on the merits as they are applied for, to set up clean energy projects across the country, different states. And then also it has a mission to help through financial and technical support to help states set up their own versions of the bank. So there's some in some states around the country, I think Connecticut, and I want to say maybe a few others in the Northeast. I forget if Pennsylvania has one. I don't think they do. Pennsylvania has one. My apologies. Pennsylvania has one. So there's some in the northeastern United States and Pennsylvania that have sort of state level versions of this already, which I think is where the inspiration came from. So the goal is to have more of those in other states. So those are sort of that's sort of the dual mission of it. But I think it.
But also to leverage private financing.
Correct. Yeah. So and as far as and I also will say that it's actually part of the confusion might be it's gone through a few name changes since it was first proposed. So this is I'm not sure how they arrived at this final name, but it used to be called something else, and I actually can't even remember what it was called. But I think it had climate in the name, which is probably why they changed it, so it would have an even lower profile. And as far as what the term accelerator is, I see the question in the chat. It basically is I think it's kind of like a private sector kind of like business term, almost borrowing from that. But basically, it's just they're just trying to like speed up the development and deployment of these clean energy projects. So wind energy, solar, like utility scale, community scale type projects. They're just trying to get them out the door faster so that we have access to more of that.
It's to accelerate the financing.
Oh,
Right.
There you go. Ed has a more succinct definition.
No, Ed is right. An incubator is accelerated or can pass off to an accelerator to facilitate financing to actually make a business launch.
Excellent. Thank you.
So-
Yeah, so there you have it.
We are rapidly running out of time. We clearly have very engaged people tonight, and the chat was absolutely filled with resources, questions. Thanks, Peter. I'm going to get mine out too, but mine looks like a dress on me. Any rate, we have a lot of resources in the chat, and when we send out the recording, we will also be sending out the chat for all the resources. And we're going to get so many more from Brian that we will be reading and acting forever. But I just wanted to lift up what Dana wrote in the chat, because it's a very interesting and completely different approach. It's working not with elected officials in the government, but working with decision makers in the financial world. So Dana, if you could give us like a little brief thing about what Philadelphia area is doing, but this is part of a national effort that I'm going to be leading and be working with IPL on.
Well, thank you, Phyllis. For the last 6 years, I've been very active with the Earthquaker Action Team, which is Philadelphia-based, originally organized by Philadelphia Quakers in 2009, but currently certainly an ecumenical organization where we would definitely welcome your involvement. EQUATE is the acronym. EQUATE is a nonviolent direct action or environmental activist organization. So NVDA means, as Phyllis said, we do not advocate with public officials. I mean, we certainly recognize the value of that. Our role is to put pressure, and specifically, we've been focusing on corporate accountability. So we've focused on accountability for PNC Bank, which was financing mountaintop removal coal mining. They no longer do that. We put a lot of effort into pressuring PECO, our local electric utility, to buy more than 1% of its energy from solar energy producers. That campaign did not succeed. PECO can be very stubborn. Currently, we've joined with a worldwide campaign focusing on the financing of fossil fuel development and infrastructure, which is proceeding at very high levels at the current time. Currently, the Vanguard Group, which manages over $8 billion in mutual funds and other investment vehicles. The Vanguard Group typically is the #1 investor in fossil fuel companies, fossil fuel projects, banks that fund the fossil fuel industry. And so this is a campaign to put a stop to the money pipeline. It's a global campaign. Vanguard is headquartered in Malvern, outside Philadelphia. So it's a local target. We are going to be showing up in force on Earth Day, which is Friday, April 22nd, to confront Vanguard. This will be the culmination of a 40-mile walk connecting Chester, where Vanguard's investments are associated with some really shocking environmental injustice and environmental racism. So there'll be a 40-mile walk. On Wednesday, there'll be an action at the Chase Bank in Wayne. And we'd love to have your participation, and you can find the specific details at eqat.org, equate.org.
Thank you. Anybody else want to mention any other actions other than the petitions that we can sign, the articles we can read, the things we can be doing? This is certainly an important time for everybody to be involved.
Phyllis, I'd like to just mention to everybody that tomorrow the Philadelphia Public Financial Authority becomes law in Philadelphia. And that's a huge breakthrough in terms of some of the issues of financial equity, putting financing locally, not into fossil fuel projects, but to grow a sustainable community and to work on the kinds of projects that that make a real difference in terms of climate disruption. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So it's time for us to say goodbye, and thank you so much for coming tonight and engaging. And to those of you who are celebrating St. Patrick's Day tomorrow, wearing your green, whether it's an EDF green shirt or what other, drinking green beer. Also, tomorrow happens to be tonight and tomorrow happens to be a Jewish holiday, and there's a lot of relationships that I see, parallels between the story of Purim, which is this holiday, and the war in the Ukraine, where a bad person tries to destroy a civilization or a peoplehood, but the people prevailed, and it was their will and their strength that made it happen. So happy spring, and we will meet again in April. If you have ideas for a speaker or a topic, please let Amani or I know, and we'll be happy to find it. And thank you again, Brian, for so much information. I took pages of notes.
I'll send you some follow-ups, and
Yeah,
and
your
thank you
promise
again.
for so much more.
Yeah, thank you, Anne, for the invitation. I really appreciate it, and it was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
you. All right.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Have a great night.